Copernican, how's everything going?
It's going good. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I wanted to have you on because I read this article by you, which I thought was honestly brilliant, and I'll obviously link to it. But it's about urban bugmen and the AI model collapse and this unified theory. And I really it was one of the most original pieces I've read. But just to give people a background, can you summarize what you wrote in this piece?
Yeah, sure. So the best way to put this is it's a combination of ideas that people have been playing with for a while, especially when it comes to topics like AI systems, because AI systems provide us with an analytical method of observing intelligent systems sort of from the outside. And one of the big problems that AI systems have been running into is model collapse, where if you train an AI model on AI generated data, the model ceases to function given a long enough time frame. Usually it's just a few generations of models trained on AI generated data that break down. And having a somewhat of a background in physics and mathematics, there's information theories about the way the world functions. And so if there's an underlying system in which corrupted information acting as training data causes advanced cognitive systems to collapse, that would indicate that the underlying principle doesn't only apply to AI models, and that the underlying principles likewise apply to all cognitive models, including human and other mammalian cognitive models, especially those that are trained on a generational basis. So the article discusses and sort of tries to bring into focus this idea that there's a single underlying information theory that may explain the collapse that you see in human societies and human psychology that occurs in highly urbanized and artificial environments. Because in those situations, what you have are people that are mostly trained from childhood, i.e., a generational system of training a cognitive model. They're trained from childhood on information that is heavily corrupted by information that is produced only by other people. In the article itself, I specify how walking on a sidewalk gives you a different kind of information from walking up a rocky slope. One of them is more real, so to speak. And I'm not a good enough physicist or don't have a strong enough background in physics in order to identify like what percentage of that information that you receive as a child learning how to walk is real versus artificial, and what really qualifies as a class of entities. So if you train a person on information solely created by other people, you're going to experience model collapse. But in reality, what we have is a whole lot of different types of information that we interact with every day. Some of it's artificial, a lot of it's artificial, but a lot of it isn't. Sensory information that's input to a person. The reason why AI helps bring this into focus is because we can actually qualify exactly what types of data AI models are trained on at any given time. AI models are trained on known information. So we know exactly how many images they see, we know exactly how much text they read, and we know what percentage of the information they receive is AI generated versus real, so to speak. And so for a human, while it's a very fuzzy distinction between the two, there's appears to be a structural system in which an underlying physical rule about the way information works in reality in the physical world about retraining successive generations on corrupted data that applies just as much to us as it does to AI, but it's much fuzzier to see in a human context than it is in a digital context. But it does indicate that things like the Mass Utopia experiments by John Calhoun and things like AI model collapse and things like the degeneration of human societies and specifically psychology in highly urbanized environments, especially highly artificial environments, get out and touch grass, are all structured off of this underlying physical principle rather than just being social issues to deal with. These are physical rules that we're bumping into that we don't really understand.
And wanted to dig into that a little bit because the way you described why the model collapse happens is that there's an information loss with each generation. So you bring up the example in the article of 60-40 split between a particular possible what's on the net right now, what the training data that it has on a particular answer, for example. And because of the way AI works, is that it'll pick the 60%, the majority thing most of the time. So by the time it gets to the second generation, it might go down to like 85-15, and eventually the minority just sort of disappears entirely as a result of a lot of this processing and all that stuff. That in turn causes the universe of training data to get weaker and weaker and less information dense and more uniform, and ultimately that's what causes the model collapse. Can you describe for us like how you think that might work in sort of like a human context? Because that information loss is definitely like a big part of this AI generation thing. And I've been told by a lot of people that are doing a lot of AI. The reason is because just the AI models are not big enough, right? Like as many, they can have like a billion parameters or whatever, but the real world of information is just way, way larger. And ultimately what AI does is it compresses information, and in that compression, you naturally get a lot of loss. And that's the process by which this model collapse happens. So, given your thesis, how do you think this applies to human beings? Like, how does this information loss happen within generation to generation as people come into these artificial environments and so on?
All right, so this comes down to human cognitive theory. And I wrote an article on AI models and why they will never be artificial general intelligences. And the primary reason for that is you would have to slow them down. And I take that from a form of human cognitive theory that, again, it hasn't been explored very much because people don't like the social implications. But I very much stand by this theory of human cognition. And if this is correct, or if some variant of it is roughly correct, then it effectively prevents artificial general intelligences from being fast enough to be particularly useful to us. And so what this system is the human cognitive model that, as I understand it, is different regions of the brain that are very good at modeling specific phenomena. This was shown in a number of studies. You can find a radio lab on it from, I think, 2012 that's very interesting, called Words, with one of their sub-stories being called The Man Without Words. And what it indicates is speaking, or sign language, speaking a natural language allows different regions of the brain to network with each other and creates sort of the inner monologue that people have, or most people apparently. And so the cognition that you experience is about a dozen or 24 different parts of the human brain that are very, very good at abstract pattern recognition. So when somebody throws a ball at you, you just catch it. Like, you don't do the mathematics to determine where it's going to land. Many people can't do the mathematics to determine where it's going to land. But the cognitive model can instantly predict where the ball is going to go based solely on past experience. And that is a specific spatial reasoning part of the brain that does that extremely well. But if you want that part of the brain to interact with the rest of the apparatus in a abstract kind of way, what you need is a network system that allows these different regions of the brain to model each other. So language is what lets you do that. Language allows you to network these different regions of the brain, and when your language centers are otherwise occupied, the regions of the brain don't network. And this was shown in a couple of studies. It's very interesting. So the study, I'm getting to the AI stuff, but the study specifically was showing that if you had somebody read and speak, or listen and speak at the same time, sort of like they were reading a script, that they could no longer process information in the same way. And so a test that has like a 95 or 100% hit rate for a person who's not talking goes down to 50% for a person who is talking about something else, because the network is occupied with something else, so it can't network these different regions of the brain. So under that auspice of a cognitive model, which is what I'm working with for the time being, because it's the most well put together understanding of why that inner monologue is so important, and what it means to be an abstract thinking sapient person. An AI system is much less a mind and much more like a specific subregion of a brain that does one thing really, really, really well. Instead of doing geospatial reasoning, or instead of analyzing colors and images for objects, well, some of them do that, but like ChatGPT, what it does is it responds with a search function on words. And so the more of these subregions we start putting together and having interact with each other, once they develop a common language between each other, because ChatGPT is not a common language for the AI brain regions, ChatGPT is just a fine search function on a dictionary. It's a very, very good one, but it's not a cognitive reasoning language apparatus. So if we get enough of these together and have them start talking to each other and networking each other, in theory, you could create a sapient entity. But making it fast could be a lot more difficult. It's a lot faster to catch a ball than it is to come up with a complex abstract sentence. And the reason for that is the language network actually slows down the process, which forces these different regions of the brain to model each other. Anyway, so ChatGPT, AI systems, are specifically subregions of brains that are very good at doing specific small tasks, and they are very good at it, and they do it very, very fast. Model breakdown then occurs in these subregions when they're fed bad data. So normally an AI will see what's sort of a Gaussian distribution, or a normal distribution of data, with this big hump in the center and these long tails out to both sides for randomized data in a higher dimensional vector space, because that's how AI systems work. But think of it as just a normal Gaussian distribution. A normal distribution, with a big hump in the middle. It's what your professors show you when they give you your grades, and they say, well, you got a C. You got in the middle. That's what the C means. So the real world has long tail distribution weird data in it, and humans aren't very good at modeling this either, actually. So networked cognitive systems are not actually very good at modeling long tail data, which is to say very, very low probability events just don't generally fall within our models. We generally assume the electricity is going to work and don't model our lives around it not working. But a lot of people, they just simply cease to function if the electricity goes off. Whereas you've got people that are better at modeling these long tail distributions that have like an extra battery pack or something like that, because they recognize the relatively low probability poses a relatively high risk in their personal lives. And so that's what that long tail distribution data is. It's low probability events, some of which can have catastrophic consequences. When you train a cognitive model, it tends to forget low probability data. And this is true for people just as it is for AI systems. So if you feed an AI 10,000 images, and 100 of those 10,000 are of a different type. So the example that they give in the paper that discusses this is pictures of dogs. If 70% of your data is golden retrievers, then what the AI will produce is like 95% golden retrievers. And an AI trained on that data will produce 100% golden retrievers. And an AI trained on that data will start to fall apart and no longer really understand what it's looking at and start making a mess. So what you effectively do in removing real-world information is you remove an accurate understanding of long-tail distributions. And some AI, they are getting a little bit better at this, but what they'll do instead is they'll produce nonsense data in their long-tail distribution instead of producing a proper long-tail distribution. So they'll produce just weird stuff, but in small probability, because they know there's supposed to be something else there. They just don't really have a good idea of what it is, because they've averaged all the data that they've gotten. And that's where you get like human conspiracy theories from, is where our cognitive social models know that there's supposed to be something in the long tail distribution, but we don't have any good idea of what it is. So we base it on stories or bad television shows or things like that. Not to discount conspiracy theorists. I mean, the difference between a conspiracy theory and fact is about 5 years right now. Um, but there's a lot of weird ideas that people come up with that fit into that long tail, and it's because they know that something goes there, but they don't know what specific bits of information are supposed to go there, which is the same problem that AI systems run into. So when it comes to human cognitive models reflecting AI cognitive models or AI neural networks, what you have is specific regions of the human brain designed to interact with specific types of data that decay when provided with false data, is a good way to put it. The social regions are somewhat vulnerable to this through mass media. I mean, we kind of saw this with the boomers, where they start trying to pretend like cable news and sports ball is the way the world really works. Then we see with the internet, there's a lot of weird advertisement stuff that people are getting away with right now, and it's because the human cognitive model will average to what they see in terms of advertisements, which is one interesting feature that I've noticed about this is people who use ad block seem to be fundamentally like psychologically different from people who don't, just from their exposure
Wow.
levels, which again is just interesting. Um, in terms of like physical interactions, we mostly receive real data from that for the time being. Although you do have a couple of outliers that play way too many video games that start getting physically sloppy, is a good way to put it, because their visual cortex is so focused on like artificial media that they lose some of their acuity for physical interaction. And again, this is stuff that you've kind of seen, but it's really hard to put your finger on a specific instance of it. But it's more of a generally fuzzy concept, and it's because different aspects of the human mind, different bits of these sub cognitive regions of the brain break down in different ways and experience bad data in different ways. And so what you end up with is sort of a hodgepodge of somebody who's like 85% there and 15% is just missing. Hence the NPC meme. Um, because that meme refers specifically to people who have a very hard time understanding social systems and tend to default to whatever the television says because that's the only social system that they functionally train on for the most part, which is really weird to me as somebody who doesn't do that. But you can definitely denote distinctions in terms of model category. Um, there's 2 points that were brought up that I think were very interesting, sort of in the comments of the article. One of them is that religious traditions or like long-standing cultural traditions are sort of like a preserved infusion of so to speak uncorrupted data into the social system, as long as they're maintained over long periods of time. Like this is the good data that our great 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 grandparents developed, and we're just going to give it to you straight. Those seem to. This is one reason I think that religious communities tend to stand up a little bit better to the social decay that exists in the, for again back lack of better phrasing, corrupted data that people take in, the regurgitated data from the society that they take in. Religious communities tend to be more resistant to that because they have a higher percentage of quote unquote, good raw data, so to speak, that's coming into their social identity. Um, so that's one of the things that has helped buoy some cultures over other cultures when it comes to the sort of cognitive decline. And we have to accept that there is a psychological cognitive decline. It specifically appears to concentrate on social interactions and an individual's sense of self in terms of neuroticism, depression, drug abuse, that kind of thing. We are seeing a very real social decline, and it seems to mostly occupy uh, social the social regions of the human brain for the time being, because those are the ones that get the most artificial data.
Yeah, as I was reading this article, you mentioned the whole NPC meme and the media industrial complex and everything else. That's the first thing I thought of was that the inputs that people train on are like mass media, 12 years of government education, things like that. It's often very simplified and compressed versions of reality that they want you to know, not necessarily even doing it nefariously, but like thinking about the history of the Civil War. It almost always comes down to, well, the Civil War happened because of slavery, when in fact it's actually a lot more subtle, and there were a lot of other tensions and a lot of economic factors and things like that that were part of it. But very few people actually get all of that data. In fact, instead, what they receive is just this very short lesson that Civil War started because of slavery. And that in turn means that the entire tail distribution of information, the fat tail that you were talking about, actually doesn't ever enter their brain. And this is when I read your article and thought about NPCs, this was the thing that seemed to be very missing from NPCs, is that they don't get all of the nuance or subtlety around the fractal nature of information. Is that instead of thinking about, okay, what was the actual thing that happened, they get a narrative, and that's all they get a very short narrative, a compressed narrative, and that's all they train on. And as a result of that, they end up kind of breaking down because, like you said, they have high levels of anxiety, depression, things like that, where they're not functioning properly because they're essentially fed not just like bad data, but very compressed data, very simplified data that they can't really do that much with because there isn't subtlety or nuance that they can go and explore and think about more deeply. Instead, this is how it is, and this is how you must act. And when they find that that's like very depressing, then they get depressed instead of thinking through it and finding other perspectives and thinking through things a different way.
Yeah. Data fidelity and first principles, I'd say, are sort of the two key points that I think are really important to discuss there. So the human mind and AI systems and every other trainable cognitive system, as far as we can tell, is a tremendously powerful data compression tool. And you can see this in how much information the visual cortex will just eliminate from your conscious mind and your memory. I did this experiment the other day because I thought it was funny, and because I was legitimately curious at the time. It was while I was kind of working on this article a couple of weeks ago. There is a fence that I walk past every day, almost every day. Yeah, I basically see it every single day. And I walked past it in the morning, going to where I work, and I paused, and without looking at it, was trying to remember. You know how there's like horizontal bits in a fence and vertical. There's the vertical shafts that hold the horizontal bits together. How many horizontal poles there were in the fence? Like the specific number of them. And I had an image in my mind of where it was, and I had an image in my mind of the exact size of the thing, but I could not remember for the life of me how many horizontal bars were in the fence. And so the human mind does that a lot, actually. If you're listening to this and think that it's interesting, try to remember something like that, like a specific numerical detail about an object that's behind you and not in your field of view right now. And very few people outside of those with like truly eidetic memories will be able to do it. And the reason for that is because there's no need for the human mind to memorize those aspects of reality. And because we compress data so much, most people operate in a world that's best described as like a sketch or a stick figure world, where they know where all the lines are, they just don't know. It's just low fidelity. They know there's a fence there, but they can't tell you extreme details about bits of the fence or how many bolts there are. I mean, most people should know this. How many bolts are there in your tire that hold your tire on? Is it 5 or 6 or 8? There's different types of tires, so see if you can remember. but little things like that are not necessary for you to function as a person. And so what you're engaging in is just tremendous amounts of data compression for the amount of information you take in. Because if it's not relevant, your brain will simply delete it and overwrite the data with other information. And your spatial reasoning part of the brain doesn't need to remember the exact shape of everything. It just needs to remember roughly where it is, or exactly where it is if you're going to be an athlete. So what you end up with is when people then regurgitate data, the fidelity goes down because they can only recreate the data that they've saved, so to speak, the information that they've saved, and so regurgitated information inherently lacks the necessary fidelity of the real world. With AI systems, you see the same thing, especially like the AI image generators, when they try and do architecture, have a really, really hard time with it. And you'll get lines that sort of feed into each other a little bit here and there. It'll look good from a distance in the same way your memory of a place will look good from a distance. But when you actually try and analyze, detailed small parts of it, you're going to have a very hard time. Um, so in many ways, AI systems do function very similarly to the human brain. And if we can get, I don't know, a few dozen of these radically different systems cross-talking with each other and trying to model each other, and then give them a language to do that with, we could see an artificial general intelligence. But it would be slower because it would operate at the speed of the language, not at the speed of the individual subsections. And so, like, I don't think there's a lot of companies interested in linking a dozen data centers to each other to get an AI that's basically what we already have, but somewhat worse. Um, so, and it would require a lot of R&D and experimentation. Granted, they have a lot of money to do that with, so we'll see where they go. But I do think that an artificial general intelligence would probably be more trouble than it's worth for the purposes that they're trying to develop artificial intelligences for the time being. Um, so that's the data fidelity problem. And the other thing that has helped, at least partially, societies remain functional are first principles. Now, very few people seem to be able to do this. You need to be about two standard deviations up on the IQ curve in order to do this, somewhere around two. And it depends on the topic. Some people are much better at doing it from some topics than others. But first principles is the idea that understanding the basic way reality works allows you to build a wholly, artificial, so to speak, a wholly internal model of the way the world works that's actually congruent with the way the world works. A good example of this is people who operate from first principles. That's a good way to put it. They need to be very relatively experienced in the field, but people who operate on first principles in terms of mechanics, they don't need to have a layout of the engine to understand how a given engine works. They understand how a fuel injector. There's got to be a fuel injector system somewhere. There's got to be a vacuum pump somewhere. There's got to be an exhaust port somewhere. So for relatively simple systems, they can just go into them and understand them. Again, this is for materials that they've somewhat studied and understand the operating first principles for. But there's really nothing more interesting to me. I do mechanics just because it's fascinating to me when you talk to a mechanic and he reaches under your hood and he rips a piece of equipment out and throws it on the ground and says, "You don't need that anymore. All right, you can go. It's fixed." Like, and
Nice.
you're like, "What was that? How does it work?" And it's not just because he understands, your specific engine really well, although I presume he does, but because he understands the first principles, not in how your engine is designed, but in how your engine functions. Um, so he doesn't need to look at the design layout and specifically calculate what pulling that piece of equipment out will do. He understands the underlying function of the system and knows that uh, and knows that this set of hoses or whatever is redundant to your system, or that vacuum pump probably failed, but you've got a spare that'll light up if you remove it. Um, just ideas like that.
Yeah, that reminds me of a lot of people where they can't think in first principles, right? They're thinking in terms of whatever they're taught and whatever they're
Yeah,
given
what
instead
they've
of thinking
iterated
about.
upon.
Yeah, yeah, and the people that do have those first principles thinking things are a lot more competent. And as you were saying, AI isn't general for a reason, and part of that is that I don't think AIs are actually very good at first principles thinking because that's not what they're designed to do. They're next word predict, autocompletes basically that are a little more complicated and not actual thinking about things and what is this thing, how's it work, and what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and things like that. And honestly, this is one of the things that drives me crazy about like doing any tech support or whatever. I'm a programmer, so I see this a lot. A lot of people just can't seem to think that way. It's I can look at a program and say, okay, well, this is what it's trying to do. So data has to come in somewhere, and data has to go out somewhere, and where is it happening, and what are the steps that are happening? Instead, like people think, okay, what are the buttons I press to make this work? And
Yeah.
that's like very frustrating to me because they don't want to understand the entire system, and that seems to be the big problem, not just with AI, but with actual people and the way that you're describing non-first principles thinkers.
Yeah, most people, especially with modern electronics, learn by rote. Um, I'm I'm worse at coding than many other things. Like my background's engineering and not computer engineering, um, engineering, physics, that kind of thing. But what it does is, so my physics background when applied to something like an engineering problem allows me to understand the underlying elements of where pressure is moving to. How mechanical systems are designed, why they're designed that way, where the forces are pointed, and so when it comes to like mechanical systems, I tend to try and operate from a first principles perspective. Where's the kinetic energy going? Where's the momentum? Um, but in terms of coding, yeah, I totally operate by rote on coding. Coding is very very complicated. So I respect your skill in that field. Like I can make things happen, but I don't really have a good understanding of why they happen that way. Um, so yeah, I think even then, when people do operate from first principles, they're generally operating from first principles within a specialty. But it definitely helps a tremendous amount in terms of cognitive sustainability. One thing that we don't really have, as far as I can tell, is a very good system for understanding human social first principles. We've got a number of models that try to work on first principles for social systems. You've got sort of Freudian models and the Jungian models. You've got the Darwinian models, which is sort of your materialism and your humanism and whatnot. Um, and there's the human social and moral system um, doesn't operate on first principles because I don't think anybody's ever developed a set of first principles that's good enough to call it that. I'd argue that the best ones are the old religious traditions because the post Enlightenment materialist traditions have been an absolute disaster. Um, well, I
Well,
mean, so
I could give you at least one that I think might qualify, and that would be Austrian economics, because that definitely operates from first principles and
that's true.
actually tries to
I'll give you
derive
Austrian
things that.
economics. But Austrian and Keynesian economics are both designed for a world where you can keep growing the economy.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, it's not designed for that. Austrian
oh,
economics, at least, is based on praxeology and just here, or man acts. Like what happens and things like that,
well,
and
yeah, yeah, I
it
know.
derives all of those from that. So
Well,
I wouldn't say it's
well,
designed
this is
for
what
it.
I would argue with even Austria. Like Keynesian economics, we can probably completely agree on. But
Yes.
I would argue that even Austrian economics is predicated on the idea that the economy can continue growing. Um, because if it can't continue growing, what you end up with is mercantile economics, where nations attempt to tariff imports and maximize exports in order to accrue wealth inside the nation. like the old style. This would be like Dutch Empire era economic systems before the Wealth of Nations was written. Um, so that'd be my argument. And the
Okay,
reason
what, but regardless, you
okay,
were saying
okay,
about like first principles and
okay, yeah, yeah. First
sociology and
principles.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, moral and social theory. I don't think has moral and social theory. I don't believe has a isn't done yet. Is a good way to put it. I know a lot of work has been put into them. I know that I really like. I mean, he gets a little nutty sometimes, but and he had the 6 hour crash out stream, which I thought was amazing. I did not watch the whole thing. I've only seen clips. But Rudyard Lynch describes and that's the What If Altist YouTube channel. You'll see him
Mm-hmm.
around. He's mentioned more than a little bit in some of these circles.
Mm-hmm.
But Rudyard Lynch discussed a couple of years ago about how the 20th century was the wars of humanist religion, where you had
Mm-hmm.
communism, fascism, and liberalism, respectively, going to war with each other to determine who was the best materialist. And they've all been a disaster. Communism collapsed under its own weight. Fascism is so aggressive that it tends to align everyone else against it because it's Darwinian. It's purely Darwinian. And I understand the point of being purely Darwinian, but it does tend to make everybody around you who is not you very nervous. Um, so then you've got fascism and liberalism kind of works, but it doesn't have a holistic worldview the way communism and fascism do. So liberalism only continues to work. Who is it? Yuval Harari's book Homo Deus goes into this in a lot of detail in like the first half. It's a really good book. Um, but liberalism effectively just tries to do the just everyone be nice principle, but doesn't have a descriptor for what nice is or consists of. So liberalism works until it successfully kills its own religious traditions. And once it kills its own religious traditions, it disintegrates, as we've seen over about the last 20 years. I would argue that the Satanic Panic and the backlash to the 1980s Satanic Panic was a nearly successful death blow against like American exceptional Christianity. The American exceptionalism Christianity premise, which is why the new sort of Christendom that's being built by the Zoomers and the younger generations is very different from the old Boomer Christianity. It's much more militant. Um, but the successful like death blow against cultural Christianity that was dealt by liberalism effectively signaled the end of liberalism one generation later, because it because without an underlying moral system and holistic worldview about what being nice is and what being a good person consists of, it just degenerates into people arguing over victimhood status. Because liberalism doesn't have anything other than take care of everybody, and anybody who can make a successful argument that I am not sufficiently well taken care of gets to be on top of the pile in liberalism. Um, so I would
Well, so
argue
let's
all three of them,
dig
all
into
three
that.
of the materialist religions collapsed. And as a
Mm-hmm.
proxy for that, they collapsed because they didn't have a first operating principle for sociological systems. And
Mm-hmm.
they also, and liberalism, and all of them actually, specifically rejected the injection of like good, uncorrupted data from ancient historic religions
Mm-hmm.
that has been keeping human societies running for thousands of years. So the
Mm-hmm.
combination
Yeah.
therein is why the social systems are failing in the way they are. It's because there's so much regurgitated data that people are training on, and they have very little access to anything else.
Yeah, which brings me to I want to dig into this a little bit more because all three of those ideas, right, fascism, communism, liberalism, they're really children of the Enlightenment, and you can sort of see its development through Nietzsche and Marx and many other people, but it really began in the Enlightenment, and I was thinking about like the Mouse Utopia experiment that you put into your article about how they started collapsing like around 15 generations after the very first one, in this sort of like mouse utopia state. And I was thinking about the Enlightenment and around when it started. I would say maybe like 1700 or so. And if you count 25 years of generation, that's been about 13 generations since the Enlightenment. And we have gotten to the point where we're getting sort of that ideological model collapse as a result. And like you said, each generation sort of regurgitated what the previous generation was saying, and there was some sort of information loss. There was compression and simplification, and to a point where you murder millions and millions of people through stuff like World War II and gulags and the cultural revolution and things like that. And you get to a time where like stuff starts making almost no sense at all. And I think about stuff like the transgender stuff, right? Like you can be any of 55 genders or something like that. You get a lot of just very weird things in the culture that come out of this sort of almost ideological model collapse. Do you think that the Enlightenment, which essentially rejected God, right? It was this idea that you can have all of the morality and civilization good, even some parts of natural law without God. That transition ultimately ended up with the ideological collapse that we had. Or what do you think was the actual thing? If you don't think it was the denial of God.
Well, I think that it didn't help, is a good way to put it, because a lot of the Enlightenment thinking originated with Christianity as its substrate. So a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers were quite theistic in terms of their original ideas. But the resultant materialist religions rejected the religious premise while attempting to keep everything else. And again, this is why Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, is pretty good. Because it sort of discusses, I describe it as like the last good liberalism book that discusses what liberalism's trying to do and predicts what it would do next if it continued to be a dominant theological position, because it's really kind of a theological position. But it isn't a dominant theological position anymore, which is probably for the best, all things considered. We just need to get the tech bros to stop believing in it. The What ended up happening, I think, is that the scientific model is so good at predicting the natural world that people started applying it in ways where they really, really shouldn't. And in that application, people started to believe in that model as a descriptor of morality when it really isn't. Rather, it is this is how things work. It's not a descriptor of why things work. And you need a why if you're going to be discussing topics like good and evil and social function. You definitely need a why. Why do things need to be this way? Because the answer of because the government will kill you if you don't is not very satisfying to most people, as we saw with the Soviet Union. And so my argument would be that rather than it being liberalism's rejection of God, I'd say liberalism's rejection of God is a byproduct of a population mass adopting sort of a misapplication of the scientific method in combination with a dramatic increase in what's the way to put it, human quality of life as generated by the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution, basically from forever until the late 1700s, cities tended to lose population faster than they gained it. And that was generally due to disease, which is why the advent of modern modern sewage systems and modern sanitary systems is so crucial to human development, because populations would just decline faster than they would grow due to disease. And the only reasons you had cities was because people would move in from the countryside where people were having five, six, seven kids. Um, and then in the I even I think it might even have extended until the 1800s, where cities were mostly population sinks. Again, it's a fuzzy area, but by the early 1900s, cities were seeing their own population growth, which is something that's almost never happened before in human history. And then toward the late 1900s and the 21st century, um, you saw cities return to their original status as population sinks. So I'd argue that what we're experiencing right now is this is not the first time it's happened in human history. This is just the first time in written history that this has happened, which is that the Industrial Revolution is behaving very similarly to the Agricultural Revolution. Now, because the Industrial Revolution is global and the Agricultural Revolutions were regional, so you'd have regional issues where this would happen. But what you would see, what we have vague records of, is the best way to put it, is that the agricultural revolution would occur. A bunch of tribes would start farming. Their populations would triple, and then their populations would fall back down significantly. So you would see this massive rise in population followed by a fall in population. And clearly, we're going through that at a global level now, where cities have turned back into population sinks. And I would argue that one of the primary reasons that they are that way is because when you attempt to apply the scientific method to moral systems, what you end up with is, well, if the government says it, it must be true, source of behavior, because you end up with expert systems, and the expert says it, so it's true. You end up with this really bizarre priest class coming out of academia, especially the social sciences bit of academia. Whereas actual academics who do understand the material know that is not what any of these systems are saying, but the general population likes to believe it. And that, combined with the sudden rise of a high quality of life and extremely high density population environment, has resulted in a large number of people intaking information from this high density environment that's almost entirely artificial. So you have cities that are artificial ecosystems built by people for people, and thus all of the data, not all of it, but a much higher than normal percentage of the data available in a city is regurgitated data. Um, Data that was, first by whatever guy made the bricks. He's the person who influenced the type of data that the bricks contain, and then every person who walks past it or leans up against it forever thereafter is absorbing some part of what he thought the world was supposed to be like. Um, and so you end up in a situation where they disconnect from the religious traditions by rejecting God and by absorbing the scientific method and experts and government as God, which was really bad in the Soviet Union, but it's not great in our system either. We've sort of taken some of the worst managerial parts of the Soviet Union and just applied them to a free market. Um, so you've got an environment where people have rejected the historical truths. They've rejected God in the form of the historical truths, and then they've also put themselves in an environment where they cannot reconstruct first principle truths from the information that they're presented with for the most part. And so I would argue that it's the combination of that that has led to such catastrophic cognitive decline in many of our urban areas. And it's really bizarre too. I'll give another anecdote too. This is a weird one that I experienced. It was a sort of family reunion many years ago, and I won't go into details, but um, I like living in a rural area. I kind of grew up in a rural area, but I really am that kind of person. I just like being out in the woods. It's my thing. Um, but the result of that is that when I went to this family reunion, which is like in this suburb on the beach, you know what it's like in relatively not like highly urban areas, but sort of suburban, higher population density, that sort of environment. When I went there, I'd hang out with my extended family a little bit. Um, their kids, that kind of thing, go to the beach and whatnot, drink heavily because we're that kind of family. But the only like random person I bumped into, because again, I'm from a rural area, I like chatting with people, I like doing podcasts, that kind of thing. The only person I really got along well with was like 4 buildings over, where he converted a garage into a wood shop. And I ended up spending like 4 to 6 hours in there over the course of 5 days just bullshitting with this dude who was a cabineter. Like he made cabinetry. That's his thing. And out of like the 700 or 800 or 900 people I met there, including my own family, the person I liked the most was that random guy. Because that random guy had a model of reality that made sense because he worked with real world objects. It's not we did this in the code and we have a 3D model of this bit of engineering that we can talk about, or this is how the dashboard set up on a nuclear reactor works, which is what one of them was talking about. Um, but it was this dude who's like, I I'm not sure if he's clearly like missing part of one of his fingers because he got it stuck in a machine at one point, like a lathe or something. Um, like he has a physical, real understanding of both physical labor, um, and the way the world actually works in practice rather than the way it works in theory. And people with those types of first principles or physical models of reality that are accurate will have a very hard time um, getting along well with the people who would understand reality only in the abstract sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and that's something that I think as a Bitcoiner I've experienced quite a bit, and I get along with Bitcoiners largely because they're from that same class of people that you're describing of people that try to think from first principles, can't stand bureaucracy and rule following that is just for the sake of rule following and so on. And it's funny because when you meet other Bitcoiners, you find that they've thought about stuff like nutrition and working out and even like meaning and religion and purpose in a completely different way than most people have, and it's quite refreshing to sort of like go and talk to them because oftentimes they're doing stuff that other people are not, and they're thinking about things in a very refreshing and original way. It's like filling your mind with some of that minority fat tail data that you were talking about earlier.
I am also very partial to cryptocurrency, particularly the gold standard of cryptocurrency. So, yeah, that's
Well,
probably one
we
reason
should
we're
talk
getting
about that
along.
at some point.
Yeah, we should talk about that at some
I,
point.
actually, let's talk about that now because it is something that I was thinking about with respect to to this piece because, in a sense, the gold standard was what was money for a long time, and it had a certain reality to it. And if you study the history of gold or history of money, it was almost always physical objects like salt or seashells or rye stones, something physical representative in the world, and it converged to gold, I guess, in the 19th century, late 19th century, and it was at that point that it became a little more abstract, right? It became a little more compressed because instead of having gold, you had a representation of gold. Well, before that, it was like coins, and then those got debased, and it wasn't really what it said it was, and so on. But a representation of gold became the thing that people traded instead of the gold itself, and there was some information loss, some sort of loss in that exchange, which made sort of artificial loans and fractional reserve banking and all of that a lot more viable. And then eventually it got to the point where they were doing so much of this artificial money printing that they cut it off from the gold standard altogether in 1971 with Nixon. And that level of abstraction kept going up, and the level of compression, I would argue, increased, where it became, okay, well, money is whatever the government says it is, and it's not about exchange or saving or anything like that. And that led to a a debasement of how people thought about all of those things, right? Savings and exchange and what money is and how value is construed and so on. And you've
If
gotten
money's
kind of
just
gotten like a financial model collapse of some kind,
Yeah, well,
and
if
that
money's
that seems
just
to be
made
the
up,
case.
there's no reason for you to treat it any different from the way the government does, right?
Right, right. Well, except I can't print it, right? That's a privilege that the government has, which
Well, you just trade hard
unfortunately.
enough on margin and you're basically printing it. There was a
Right, right. Which is why everyone's up to their eyeballs in debt, and the richest people have the most debt, which is kind of a thing that not a lot of people understand. But like, the richest people have actually billions and billions in debt, and they're leveraging whatever assets that they have to get more debt because they don't actually sell anything. They take loans against it and so on.
Yeah,
But
it's actually brilliant. If you can get something big to take loans against, you're basically set for life. Because you can just keep taking loans against it, and as long as the loan quantity is just less than inflation, you're set.
well, and the
Unless
asset
there's a
keeps
big
going
market,
up, right?
unless there's a big
The,
market crash, but that never happens.
that's another fat tail distribution or whatever. The other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea of uniformity in the compression of information, sort of like the song sheet that everyone ends up singing from as a result of 12 years of schooling, mass media, and so on. It requires like a very strong centralizing force to make that happen and have all of that information sort of go become a much smaller minority than it would be in a normal one, and that seems to be the case with this AI stuff. It's because of these very large models that put a lot of money into it. They centralize some of the newly produced stuff. And as you were saying before, if you had more of a diversity of different models that operated very differently, then you might actually have AI generated stuff that retains some of that information and might not the model collapse might not be as bad. But because of this centralization, it seems to be that the model collapse happens a lot quicker, and we've seen this certainly in human society with respect to school and so on. We have these weird ideologies that are being taught to kids, and the collapse seems faster as a result of centralization. What are your thoughts on that idea, rather than maybe a more decentralized system?
I have very strong opinions about the scholastic system, and I'm very happy that the Department of Education at the federal level is getting shut down because it's just been a disaster. I'm worried that AI systems will be used to effectively try and culturally lock the Western world into a specific mode of thinking. Because, I mean, if it wasn't for Grok, they would be doing it. Even Grok is a really. We saw what happened when he took his hands off Grok a while back. That was hilarious, but only lasted for 48 hours when they took the leash off. But the uh, the systems that we're operating within are inherently highly artificial, and information compression leads to a lot of mistakes that are made by people who try to interact with them. This is one reason why you see high frequency traders on Wall Street and whatnot. They have, and insider traders have such an advantage. It's because information disparity is the primary thing that these groups are trading on. They're not really trading on valuations in the market, they're trading on information they have that you don't. Which is why you're generally speaking not going to beat Wall Street unless you see them do something really stupid like overshort GameStop. But even then, if you start winning, they'll just flip the table and change the rules.
Yep,
So
yep, that's right.
yeah, so they will never be allowed to go bankrupt trading within their own system because they own it. Cryptocurrency represents something of an out for that. I'm not sure if it's. I mean, it's sort of definitionally less artificial because it's underlying mathematics. It's a first principles system as opposed to a dynamic system. But the way it trades is entirely artificial because it's very
Oh,
poorly
totally. Yeah.
regulated on the trading markets. And I mean, even in the last week, there's clearly like one or two whale pools that have been nudging the price up and down over and over and over just to see what people are doing when the market is jittery. I don't know if you've been looking at the charts at all, but that's what's been happening for the last 2 weeks. Is there's a couple of guys, I'm sure it's less than a dozen people just screwing around with the market by hitting the buy button and sell button on like $10 million of orders, or more, probably $100 million of orders. Anyway,
I would guess billions, but yeah, yeah,
I don't know
that's
if it would need
definitely
to be billions
happening.
because the amount that's actually traded isn't even that high. To jerk the
It
market,
depends on the asset, but there's definitely it's felt like that for the entire existence of Bitcoin for me.
that's also
So
true.
I've been in it since 2011. So yeah,
Oh
it's
man,
it's been that way for a very long time, and I suspect it's largely because in the end the dollar side of the trade is infinite, whereas the Bitcoin side of the trade is scarce. And
yeah.
as long as you have one infinite side, you can kind of do whatever you want and play with it as long as you have access to that liquidity.
I think in an economic sense, we've been running on an artificial system for so long that even our most skilled economists tend to operate a from a position of poor regurgitated information. Um, because we've been running on the system since 1929, basically. Um, and the Keynesian, and definitely since 1972, over 2 generations now, the Keynesian model of economics requires that the economy grow forever, faster every year, in order to remain stable. And the wealthy elite have all of their money in our economic system. And to hang on to their money, they need the economic system to remain stable. Um, Somewhere around like 1999, the economy stopped growing at the requisite rate to retain stability under the Keynesian model. And since 1999, people have been effectively, governments have been inflating their currencies with artificial debt in order to retain the illusion of growth. But realistically, we've sort of hit a rate limit on how much energy we can produce and how fast we can rip rocks out of the ground and turn them into useful materials. I mean, that's the real rate limiter. There's enough metals in the ground and enough oil in the ground to do it. We just can't pull it out fast enough to maintain economic stability. And a whole bunch of people have figured out that it's better to trade on the margin in order to be productive than it would be productive, quote unquote. It's better to trade on the margin to make a profit than it is to actually produce anything. And so the actual productivity of the West, of most developed nations at this point, I would argue, has declined. The GDP in the U.S. has grown by like 1.3% in the last couple of years, if you don't include the tech bro AI stocks. And the tech bro AI stocks are only so high because the government shoved the money hose up their ass. Um,
That's right.
so from that, like again, Nvidia, Microsoft, etc. Those are the big stocks, and they haven't actually produced anything. Nvidia's produced chips, but the chips aren't actually leading to mass production of anything else besides more AI models, and the AI models aren't making a profit because they don't produce anything that is directly useful to the consumer at the scale they claim. So excluding like the Magnificent Seven from the stock market, the U.S. GDP has only gone up like 1.3% this year, and I know inflation is higher than that, which means
Oh, way
actual
higher.
productive
Yeah.
capacity has declined. Um, I think
Yeah,
that there's a
and that's a reality is of a financialized market, and
yeah.
that's part of the model collapse of the monetary system that I think I was alluding to
There's
earlier. Is that everything's financialized, so it makes sense to go and do those zero sum games rather than anything that actually adds to civilization.
There's a book that I would recommend to the
Hmm.
listeners. So I've recommended a bunch of books now. I recommended Homo Deus a while back. Another one that I'd
Hmm.
highly recommend is a science fiction book that I've reviewed on my Substack
Hmm.
called Accelerando,
Hmm.
which starts off as a relatively generic sort of optimistic late 1990s view of high technology and the internet. Like if you've
Hmm.
read sort of the classic cyberpunk stuff, it starts off kind of like that. But the end of the story takes place like 1,000 years in the future, and it actually runs through the development of these advanced AI systems and what they actually end up doing. Now, some of it's silly, but some of it actually is really interesting, especially in the underlying premise, which is if you can make most of your profit running an AI model to trade on margin on the stock market, you don't need to produce anything. And if a bunch of people start building advanced AI models to trade on margin on the stock market and they start building their own infrastructure with the profits they're making, then at some point what you're going to end up with is an economic environment where there are no people, where people are too slow to function in these advanced economic systems, but where the AI models don't actually build anything useful, just more infrastructure for themselves, but they don't, because they don't really understand, have an abstract model for the way the real world works. All they end up with is just trading with each other in a decaying sort of post-industrial landscape that doesn't have space for people, but also can't upkeep itself. And so as the pie shrinks, these AI models get more and more aggressive in going after each other to make profits to afford their own like electricity and upkeep because it gets more expensive.
That's
It's
a very
fascinating.
interesting premise because, in a sense, it's an allegory for the bureaucratic state and the managerial state and how they just sort of suck
Yeah.
productivity from everybody else, and they are very
Oh,
aggressive,
that's
or they
that's one
get more
reason I
aggressive.
that's one reason I like Bitcoin so much is because it's an asset they can't get their grubby little fingers on.
That's right.
They really don't like I don't think people appreciate how awesome it is to have an asset where if I need to transfer $500,000 to an account in Singapore, I can do it without paying any import fees, any export fees, no bureaucrat telling me I'm not allowed to, no what are they called? Financial export.
Intermediaries.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
financial intermediaries and no export tariffs or import tariffs. Like, it's incredible that there's a tool that you can use to do that. So I would encourage to keep, I mean, like, I'd encourage the viewership to keep a quantity of Bitcoin
Well,
in
I
a
hope
cold
so.
wallet.
My
Yeah,
my podcast is called Bitcoin Fixes This, so
I
I imagine they're
fair enough,
largely
but
in it already.
I put my foot down on that one. Like the ability to do that. Don't leave it on an exchange because then they can get it. But the bureaucratic state is going to have to come apart. Did you see the recent interview from between Joe Rogan and Elon Musk? This was like
I
last week.
have not, but I suspect that it has a lot to do with what we're talking about with the
Well,
bureaucratic state. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I saw a clip from it, and very briefly go over the clip. Elon Musk was asked, and again, I do not have proof this wasn't AI, so if it was, check me on that. Um, but Joe Rogan asked Elon Musk, like, so you stepped away from Doge and you're letting that sort of function on its own thing and sort of get rolled into other bits of the bureaucracy up in Washington. And Elon Musk says, yeah, I stepped away from it because under the current political paradigm, with its current budgetary issues, the United States is unsalvageable.
Yep.
like, like the guy who got us, full flow cycle rocket engines and has been putting people in space is like, no, the U.S. national debt problem is too big to fix. That I cannot. That's the one that broke him.
Yeah.
We are so cooked.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, it's what 38 trillion the national deficit at this point. I mean, it's
Is it
more
up
than
another
it's way more
trillion
than
from the
the
last
M2
time I
money
checked?
supply. Yeah, it's just it's such an insane number, and the thing is, it's all debt. It's like there's nothing underneath, so the system has to collapse at some point. And in a sense, it's been a Ponzi scheme that's been running the whole time. In a sense, that's kind of what I got out of your article is that the ideological and sort of general the ideology of the left, right? The NPC phenomenon. It has to collapse in a very similar way because it's essentially like regurgitating on its own, or it's feeding on its own information, which is getting worse and worse. And that seems to be the case even for some people on the right, right? Like a lot of the neocon logic is, like not quite as far along as maybe the left, but it seems to be coming up against a lot of the similar contradictions and so on, where it's no longer a coherent worldview at a certain point, and it's not from first principles, but based on, like what they keep hearing, and the stuff that they heard on the news 30 years ago, as if that's like fact or something like that. And it's bad model training has corrupted a significant portion of the population, and it's sad, but they seem to be on the way down.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think you're seeing this with some of the Zoomers that are rejecting effectively the old models of reality about what you can and cannot do effectively. Um,
Mm.
there's there's clearly a fuzzy line somewhere between crazy person with a gun and nation state. Um, because if you get enough crazy people with firearms together on the same page, they become a nation state, whether you want them to be or not. And it's ideas like, I mean, I'm for real. If you have 50,000 armed dudes together that say, all right, Vancouver's a separate country, Vancouver Island, it's ours now and it's a separate country. Like, yeah, it's a separate country now. That's how it works. And the current like legal models and highly abstracted systems that we use have very limited information fidelity, and because of that, they have very limited capability of dealing with individuals or groups who simply aren't willing to follow the rules anymore.
Mm.
Um, and you're starting to see that break out in terms of new types of political opposition. And I don't mean like the weird lefty protests for the most part. What I mean is like Trump and Zoran Mamdani's interview, where
Mm-hmm.
which again was hilarious. There was a great moment for anybody who didn't see it, where the media is there and they're like, Mamdani, you referred to Donald Trump as a fascist and despot, and now you're here meeting with him in the White House. Do you stand by those comments? And he's like, well, and Trump leans in. And he's like, you can just say yes. I've been called worse. You could just say yes, and it's clearly a disconnection between the model of reality that people have been feeding on, especially urban people have been feeding on for so long, and the model of reality for how things actually work, how like legitimacy is actually acquired by a government. Um, because the United States has a huge legitimacy crisis right now. Basically, the only reason anybody respects the United States government is because they'll kill you if you don't, um, or throw you in a box. But effectively, what that means, and I think I alluded to this in a comment on Substack a while back, what this effectively means is that the United States is a slave state with a population on a perpetual edge of revolt at any given time. Which means they need to put a lot more resources into coercion than they would have needed to put into coercion, say, 50 years ago. Um, Now, again, that's hyperbole, but it does seem to be somewhat accurate in many Western nations having reached this threshold where their only form of legitimacy is through coercion, and they need to maintain the coercion because that's their only model for the way the world works. Liberalism doesn't have a model that doesn't require coercion or doesn't require extensive coercion. Like the old Holy Roman Empire did not require extensive coercion. They had a bunch of competing kingdoms and little skirmishes between them all the time. But the church kind of held the whole thing together in a way that there's no singular system through which there's no singular social system that holds the United States or any Western country together anymore. We're economic zones, and we don't like being in economic zones. We want to be in nations. Um, and all of that is a product of the governance apparatus having effectively trained itself on its own regurgitated information for so long that it's no longer effective at governing. Um, there's a limit to how much you can do this before systems become unstable in an informational sense. And again, this would be very high level mathematics in order to actually try and analyze all of this. So what I'm kind of running on is a vibes for physics and information theory, that it exists. Um, but you're looking at systems, and if it is true, then it works for every trainable system. And a bureaucracy is basically just a very complicated computer where laws go in one side and money and actions and property seizures come out the other. So bureaucracies function more like AI um, neural networks than even human minds do, because like a AI neural network, a bureaucracy cannot operate from first principles.
Mm.
Um, and then the individual people who are locked into this system, who have also trained heavily on damaged, corrupted, regurgitated data, those people are experiencing catastrophic problems because they have been locked into an environment where real information is unavailable on which they can train. Um, yeah, I think that there has to be a dramatic structural change of state in our lifetimes in one way or another. And however that ends up happening is going to be extremely uncomfortable, um, especially for those who hold positions of authority now, especially for those in the bureaucracy and the managerial state. There's uh, what is it? There's shoot, I lost it. There was a book I was going to bring up, another book, but I lost it. Uh,
It's okay. Well, I want to go back to something that I didn't realize you had a physics background,
a little bit.
but one of the things that I've been exploring with this podcast is how a lot of academic disciplines, a lot of science has essentially gotten corrupted by fiat money, by the grant system, and the exercise of science is essentially no longer very good. What are your thoughts on the state of modern physics, particularly with respect to something like string theory and I guess cosmic inflation, dark energy, dark matter? All of that seem like just so stories to me, and they're neither provable nor disprovable to a large degree, and they continue to give all of these people that promoted like sinecures and money from and rent-seeking positions and things like that. Is that a part of this model collapse? Is that a part of what's going on? Or first of all, do you agree? And if so, is it part of this
So
um,
I wrote an
collapse?
article. I think it would be last year, called "How the Sciences Became Bullshit," that I would highly recommend anybody read.
I might
Um,
have read that actually. Yeah.
there was I enjoyed writing that one.
Uh,
So I wouldn't argue that it's probably cognitive model collapse. I'd argue
mm-hmm.
that good chunks of academia are basically adult daycare, which is
Mm-hmm.
why they're highly sought after positions. Um,
Good part of corporations too, right?
yeah,
Like that's a lot of
yeah.
adult daycare. Yeah.
Academia is like the ultimate adult daycare if you can get a tenure track position. And I would argue that uh, the problem there's a few fundamental problems in academia, with the chief one being the incentive structure for the academics, because
Mm.
there's professors and whatnot that are very good at identifying real things that they would like to study, but they can't. They can only study what's a popular thing with the bureaucracy for them to study. The managerialist class effectively has control of 30 to 40% of the entire United States GDP. And that's where all of the grant funding comes from for academic studies in various disciplines.
Mm.
Um, the requirements for actually expending a grant are quite limited. So if you
Mm.
find something interesting and you want to go off on a tangent and research it, and mostly I'm dealing with the hard sciences like physics
Mm.
physics, engineering, that kind of thing, especially engineering. If you find an interesting tangent and want to go off and research it, you can't. It
Mm.
has to be in your original grant proposal material.
Mm.
Um, so that's part of the issue. Part of the issue is that the grant application process has become so messy and onerous that you basically need a university department to handle it for you. You can either write grants or you can do research, but you can't do both.
Mm.
And so what you end up with is either messy grants that don't get accepted, or very good grants from people that spend their time writing grants and not doing research. Um, Another one is the managerial state is heavily structured around nepotism in some very complicated ways. Like, an example, if you have a senator on the Department of Defense Expenditures Board, your university will be funded for some weird research just because. Whether it'll produce anything or not, your university gets funded because your senator says, well, we're diverting funds to my state. Um, and if you don't, then you don't. Then you have to have much better grant proposals in order to get anything accepted, and even then it's questionable. And so, like every election cycle, you see a shakeup over which universities get the good grants and which ones don't. Which universities have the, highly incentivized professors, faculty, staff, and which ones don't. And that's not even getting into like the immigration issues, which are also absolutely catastrophic. The student loan system has made it worse. Basically, everything the government has done to try and fix any of this has made it worse. Um, the in physics specifically, people really like string theory because the mathematics is elegant, but it's not that elegant. I don't like string theory. I think string theory is actually quite messy. It looks good on paper, but you only ever see it on paper. Um, Dark energy, dark matter are hand wavy ideas because there's got to be something. So they keep looking for dark matter particles. There are a couple of weird ideas about dark energy and what that might be coming from. And there's a bunch of really interesting ideas that do not get mainstream attraction because they're not grant funded and they don't come out of major university institutions. If you've ever read any of the work by Stephen Wolfram, I think he's brilliant. Another science fiction book I read was Shield Slatter, and if you don't know Stephen Wolfram's book, it doesn't make that much sense. But if you read Stephen Wolfram's material, then Shield Slatter is clearly heavily based on Stephen Wolfram's material. But that's a theory of if anybody's familiar with Wolfram Alpha, which I basically recommend using for everything in life. Do you want to know the caloric content of a cubic light year of pudding? It'll tell you. It's a lot. Uh, but Stephen Wolfram's work describes a purely mathematical universe that only appears physical when you look at it through um, basically funny glasses. It's a fascinating. Go read his material if you're interested in that kind of thing. I love Stephen Wolfram's stuff. I don't know if it's correct, but it is fascinating. Um, so you've got things like graph theory, things like pilot wave theory that nobody really likes, but I kind of like it for quantum mechanics. The fact of the matter is, quantum mechanics, especially like quantum chromodynamics, has been kind of stuck in a rut since the 90s. Um, since they finished identifying quasars, they've just sort of been stuck and are trying to come up with weird mathematical models and then find ways to test if they're true or not. And because they can get paid to sit on their butt and come up with weird mathematical models and then try and just figure out ways to test if they're true or not, they're going to keep doing it. Um, Realistically, though, physics really hasn't gone hardly anywhere in 30 years, which is
Yep.
concerning. It really kind of bugs me, and part of the reason for that is because if you have an off the wall idea and try to follow it, it's way harder to get grant funding, so people will only ever do it as a side project. Whereas the people who get grant funding do the things that the managerial establishment is familiar with because oh, I know what that word is, so we can fund that one. Um, yeah, it's physics in general is a mess. Mathematics has seen some interesting iterative improvements. I like kind of like where mathematics is as a discipline. Physics is a mess. Biology is very close to experiencing a golden age. If you are finishing your undergraduate, right now is a great time to go into biotech. Or if you're about to start an undergraduate, it might still be a good time to go into biotechnology because AI systems, one thing they have demonstrated to actually be really, really good at and useful for is protein folding, um, which is a crazy problem that we haven't been able to solve in any other way. Protein folding could, in theory, unlock a sort of biological revolution in the same way that physics unlocked the Industrial Revolution. in theory. So that could be the next one if the AI models pan out. But even then, they won't make a huge profit on it unless they're charging $1 million a model, and every university buys one.
Mm.
But yeah, biotech could see a huge golden age here pretty soon if the AI tech pans out on it. We're already seeing some wacky stuff developed. Um,
Mm.
so I'm pretty happy with where biology is. Psychology's always been a mess, but it's gotten a whole lot worse since it became like 80% female professors. Um, Nursing is about to collapse because once the boomers are dead, no one's going to be able to afford it anymore. Um, so
Might
yeah,
take
there's
a
a
while though.
yeah.
Yeah.
Chemistry's been the same basically since the 1800s.
Mm.
Um, it's not going anywhere fast, but it's going. It's chugging along. So it really depends on which disciplines. Um,
Mm.
Chemistry basically just exists to continue being chemistry, to continue supporting the industrial world. Materials science is doing really well, actually.
Mm.
That's one of the growing fields because we have such high precision capabilities in terms of handling materials compared to what we used to. And mind you, high precision in terms of like mining or smelting or like mass production is plus minus a half percent of chromium. It is not
Mm.
moving atoms around in specific materials. Like we're still brute forcing all of our technology
Mm.
at the industrial scale, which I think is fascinating. But that's neither here nor there. In terms of application, though, material science is actually doing really well. About 10 years ago, a polyethylene molecule was discovered that is now basically universal in all military equipment.
Mm.
They went from, oh, this is a cool thing that we can make to we've industrialized it, now all your body armor is made of it. Um, so I don't know about computer science. I'm not really deep into computer science. So you would probably be able to answer those questions better than I could. But it seems like computer science is also doing, like many of the others, it's about 60% nonsense that people are just trying to get their grants funded, and about 30% some really brilliant ideas, but it's really hard to tell the difference.
Well, I would say the 60% that's nonsense is something around quantum computing, but a lot of the rest of it is actually pretty legit. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects of this which I think relate to the fact that there's one funder for all of this stuff, right? There's essentially whoever is giving out the grants controls what the research is going to
Mm-hmm.
do, and it's a very centralized system. Whereas if you had a much more decentralized system with lots of different funders and more people that you can convince to try something new or do something different, it would be a very different dynamic. But it
Yeah.
unfortunately isn't because of the way academia works at the
Well,
moment.
and it's the way the state funds it. There's a
Mm-hmm.
great, all right, so I remember the book I was going to mention earlier. There's an excellent seminal work since 1986. Again, it's published on my Substack. There's a review of it, and I highly recommend it, called The Collapse of Complex Societies. Have you ever heard that
Mm-hmm.
one? Because I
I've
think you might
heard
be
of it, but
interested in it.
I don't think I've read it of
Okay.
complex societies.
It's by Joseph
But it's
Tainter
mhm.
in 1986, and I'd say it is the best seminal work on the topic that I've ever read or heard of. And I would highly recommend people read through it because it discusses how societies move up and down on the complexity scale depending on how much extra energy they have to try and increase their efficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what we're sort of bumping into now is, again, our energy is finite and our population is going down. Which is why they're trying to push for it. They're basically trying to do a race to the finish with AI models in order to have infinite growth forever. But that's not going to happen. Um, but one of the best quotes from that book that I really adore is that you have philosophers, historians, economists um, talk about the catastrophic collapse of human society, even though when Rome collapsed, the actual quality of life of the average peasant went up for about 100
Mm-hmm.
years thereafter. The quality of life went up because the taxes were less onerous. They were
Mm-hmm.
ruled locally. Their local community systems actually worked to support the community instead of working against the will of the government. But the reason why philosophers, economists, and academics tend to talk about the horrific collapse of human society is because overhead gets cut out when societies
They
go
get
down
cut out.
complexity levels, and that's their job. Their job is a
Yeah,
part
yeah.
of the overhead that gets removed. So I do find it very likely we're going to see a radical restructuring of the United States in one way or another over the next 10 or 15 years. It has to happen.
Hmm.
The current U.S. national debt is 38,359,112,000,000 dollars. It's
Hmm.
about to be $113 million, but there it goes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's happening every second. And honestly, I question the accuracy of that because I doubt government accounting is that accurate or efficient. It's just sort of an estimate of
It's an
some
estimate, yeah.
conglomeration or whatever. It's probably a lot higher than that. We just don't know about it. Anyway, let's start to wrap up. Are there any other things about this article that you've gotten feedback on? Because I really did think it was quite original, and it explains so many things in a very original way. What's the feedback that you've gotten on this so far?
I've gotten a lot of people that have said similar things to you, to what you've
Hmm.
said here, which is that it does seem that there's an underlying principle in terms of the laws of information physics or the physics of information and how it changes in fidelity over time in terms of the way human cognition functions, the way animal cognition functions, the way AI networks function, and the way human societies function all seem to run on this same underlying information scaling system and information training system, or not system even, the physical laws of information training appear to apply to all of these systems at varying levels. So I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people who, again, mostly they have an inkling that something's going on, but it's really hard to articulate. And I've proposed that there exists an underlying physical or informational physical law in terms of the way all of these systems work. One thing I haven't heard a lot about, but that I'd be very interested in studying. Um, there's a couple of things I'd be very interested in studying about this, but one thing that I'd really like to see is what is it? Hold on, there's a thing. It's on the tip of my tongue. I had it there for a second. Um, One thing that, well, first of all, I want to see replication experiments with the
Hmm.
Calhoun models, but I want
Hmm.
to see them with varying levels of real environmental feedback. Um, I think that what happens if you put the cages outside? What happens if you put grass in the bottom of them? Can you get up to that population limit if you give them enough real world feedback on being mice? Um, because I think that would be a great study. And then I will also think that you should run the study with naked mole rats specifically.
Okay.
Because, well, here's why. It's because naked mole rats can form eusocial societies. So they can
Hmm.
switch from being individual animals and turn into a hive with a single
Hmm.
queen that has the babies.
Hmm.
And I really want to see what happens if you do it with a eusocial mammal. Um,
Hmm.
one thing that I'd like to point out is that these sets of ideas that are presented in the article are not finished.
Hmm.
I want to see other people's opinions on them. I want to see other people thinking about them because I don't like. I have enough of a background to point my finger and say there should be a textbook on this. This needs to exist, and I think that this is all the same physical premise. But I really need like other philosophers or analysts or other people who think about these kinds of systems to weigh these ideas and weigh in on it because um, this is a very preliminary set of proposals, and I want to see what other people do with it. I'm really excited to see what other people do with it. So you or your audience are like bring it up with people. I'd love to hear their opinions.
Well,
Because
that's why I had you on this podcast, right? Because
yeah,
like it did like sort of get me down the rabbit hole of thinking about the nature of information and stuff like that. Even stuff like evolutionary theory. I was thinking in terms of, okay, is that actually true? Because in a sense, it acts a lot like these generations of AI, where if you're removing information, then how can it get more diverse, or how can it get there's a natural collapse that happens as a result of something like that. Just thinking from first principles in those ways. So there does seem to be something almost spiritual about this, in the sense that there needs to be a fresh injection of real information that needs to happen in every generation for something to not collapse like this. And
Yes, I agree.
and that seems to require some level of decentralization, first of all, which unfortunately is not very common in a fiat-fueled world, which centralizes almost everything. But it requires just like a diversity of thought. A lot of people sort of thinking really wacky things, and for me, when after reading that, it's like, okay, this is why all of these wacky, crazy people, the Alex Joneses of the world, need to exist. They provide some of this fat tail information that, like, most of it might be junk, but there's, one or two nuggets in there that's very useful in the next generation of ideas. And eventually, maybe, 5, 6 generations down, it becomes like very critical for some event that nobody anticipated, and so on. So that for me is what was like very encouraging to me in some ways. I guess because I'm part of the Bitcoin community, and because I'm sort of like an outcast in many ways. I live outside the Overton window on a lot of different things. It's like, okay, well, there's a purpose, right? There's a utility in being in society, even if I'm outside the Overton window, the allowable opinion and all that. I'm what keeps it honest. I'm part of this group of people that help things to not collapse, essentially. So for me, it was refreshing for that. I mean, I know that's not necessarily what you're aiming for, but that's the effect that it had on me, and that's what I really enjoyed about it.
Yeah, no, I think that these ideas need to be explored more deeply by a larger number of people than myself. And I am really looking forward to what people have to say about them. Um, and there's a lot of books that you can draw this material from, but nobody's ever articulated it in this way before. And I think the only reason we can now is just because we have AI as a model separate from our own minds that we can look at from the outside rather than only looking at them from the inside. Um,
And it gives us a language to talk about it, right? Like, a model collapse is not something that
yeah, that's not
existed
something we had
before.
ideas
Yeah,
about
right.
before.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a great analogy, though, and it gives us like such a vocabulary to think about these things, a mental model by which we can model our mental model. I don't know. It's kind of very meta in that way, but it's very useful.
Well, there's a stupid meme on the internet I've heard that I still think is fascinating, which is the human brain is the only organ that's ever named itself.
It's funny. It's
It's
funny.
true though.
It's kind of true. Kind of true. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Are there any books or posts that you want to promote, or any where can people follow you? All that stuff.
All right, so you can find me at alwaysthehorizon.substack.com. That's my Substack. Um, and then the specific books that I brought up in this, I brought up Accelerando. I brought up, um, and these are the books that I've
Homo
reviewed.
Deus.
Homo Deus,
Yeah.
but I haven't reviewed that one on my Substack. I really need to get
Okay.
around to that. I brought up The Collapse of Complex Societies, and I brought up one of my really old reviews when I was referencing Stephen Wolfram's material, which was Schilt's Ladder. Um, this is like one of the first reviews I've ever done on my Substack. And if I'm going to shill philosophical works, I will also recommend Industrial Civilization and Its Future, which is also reviewed on my Substack by the well-known philosopher Theodore Kaczynski.
Yeah, of course, and that's actually quite popular in the Bitcoin community, so that's great. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on. And, this conversation lasted quite a bit longer than I thought it would. But I'm glad for that because obviously we're discussing some very interesting, intriguing, explanatory ideas that I think we need a lot more further exploration and study to see how well they fit the reality that we see around us.
Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I haven't followed you directly, but I have seen clips of your material in my feed from time to time. So I just really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.